Hi, my name is Lisa Grossen. I'm a professor at BYU Law School, and specifically I teach disaster law along with constitutional law and torts and some other things as well. Obviously, disaster law is kind of very much on the top of people's minds these days, especially lawyers' minds, because disasters are so much on our minds these days. We have the West on fire and the impacts on air quality, and we have all the kind of typical disasters that happen in any given year. And then, of course, on top of that, we are currently in the midst of the most serious pandemic that we've had in a century. So all of that means that lots of our attention is focused on these kind of issues. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak to you today about some of the legal questions and issues around the COVID-19 pandemic, and to think about some of the lessons for disaster response and mitigation and recovery that prior disasters suggest for this pandemic, as well as some of the lessons that this pandemic suggests for future disasters. So I'd like to start out today by talking about the kinds of emergency powers that are available to governments to respond to disasters. So first of all, thinking about state power to respond to disasters. So while the federal government is a government of limited powers or enumerated powers and has only the powers specifically granted to it in the Constitution, state governments have plenary power to act. They have the police power, the power to act to further the health and safety and welfare of their citizens. So the main question when state and local officials act is whether their actions run afoul of some specific limitation in the Constitution, such as a right in the Bill of Rights. Of course, state law can also constrain who within a particular state system can exercise certain authorities. And state law also governs whether local officials have a lot of inherent authority to react and to act, or whether local officials must point to some specific delegation of authority from the state. So we can replicate some of the same separation of powers and kind of federalism issues that we have at the federal level, but those are really a matter of state law. And so the answers differ from state to state. But states will generally have the power to respond to disasters. And again, the important questions are really who has the power within the state scheme to exercise that state authority, and whether the state or local action runs afoul of some external constraints. So that could be federal constitutional law, other federal statutes, or other things within state law, state constitutional law and statutes. So if we think about this in the context of a particular question, like could state and local authorities impose a mask mandate, as many of them have? Do they have the authority to do so? We'd want to ask, okay, well, who within the state system is likely authorized to do that? What do state statutes tell us about where that power resides? But we're going to have this presumption that that power exists. We start from the presumption that state power to act to regulate health and safety and welfare exists. And so as long as the right person within the state scheme is exercising the power, the question is really just whether that exercise of authority is running up against and running afoul of some external constraint, like federal constitutional law. So for example, there have been allegations that requiring people to wear a mask might violate freedom of speech because there's some expressive content in wearing a mask. It might express a certain message. But if the mask mandate isn't designed and implemented to have that effect on speech, to force people to convey a particular message, the standard of review is going to be relatively easy for the state and local authorities to satisfy. And that's going to be the case with a lot of the sort of allegations that have been brought vis-a-vis masks. So we could consider the specific objections that are being brought, but I think it's pretty easy to say that as a matter of federal constitutional law, states have this power to do something like enact a mask mandate. So what about congressional power to respond to disasters? So just a little primer on emergency power. Our Constitution really doesn't specify a separate system for emergency powers like many constitutions in other countries do. It doesn't specify a lot of power that comes into play in an emergency. There's a couple of provisions that are relevant. But that doesn't mean that we don't have a broad system of emergency power in place. We really do, but it's enacted largely by way of congressional delegations of authority to the president. So whenever you have a delegation of authority to the president, of course, there has to be congressional power to enact that delegation, unless we're talking about a delegation directly from the Constitution. So I want to spend a few minutes thinking about congressional power to respond to disasters. What congressional powers are most relevant to disaster response? Well, there are a number of different provisions that might be relevant, but the most commonly relied upon in the disaster context are going to be the Commerce Clause authority and the Spending Clause. So the Commerce Clause authority, as we know, allows Congress to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. There are some limits on it that have been articulated over time, although the general thrust is that congressional power to regulate commerce is very broad. The regulated activity does have to substantially affect interstate commerce, but as long as it's economic activity, we can aggregate over all the similar economic activity and ask whether all of that aggregated has a substantial effect on interstate commerce, and the answer is usually going to be yes. There are some other limits that come out of the Obamacare cases. In particular, there's some language in that the opinions there that suggest that you can't regulate economic inactivity or compel people to engage in commerce. I think it was the Chief Justice who said you can't regulate people just for doing nothing. So I suppose there's some question about whether forcing people to wear a mask when they go out is forcing them into a market. That seems a little bit of a stretch to me, in part because of the very substantial impact on interstate commerce the pandemic is having, but also because you could tie the mask wearing mandate to specific activities like going shopping or being in particular locations, and those kind of things would probably make it specific enough that you could require mask wearing under this Commerce Clause authority. So of course there are questions about enforcing a mask mandate. So even if you assume that the federal government has the authority, that Congress would have the authority to enact a mask mandate pursuant to the Commerce Clause, who's going to enforce that? Can they rely on state and local officials to enforce it? The general rule is they can't force state and local officials to implement federal law, to be the administrators of it. Some of the dissenters in the Supreme Court cases that held that said things like, well, what about in a pandemic where we need to vaccinate lots of people, for instance? Can the federal government not compel state and local officials in that context to enforce the federal law, to be their hands in enforcing a mandate for a mask, or enforcing a vaccination requirement, or just getting vaccinations done? The majority in those opinions seem to suggest that there weren't emergency exceptions to these non-commandeering principles, that the federal government can't commandeer the enforcement apparatus of the states. But of course, that question wasn't squarely before the court. So it's possible you could get an exception carved out. But in general, the understanding is that the federal government can't compel state and local officials to implement federal policies like a mask mandate. And so it's hard to imagine, even if the federal government had such a mandate, what the enforcement would look like. They could rely on cooperative enforcement, of course. But in terms of forcing state and local officials to implement that mask mandate, that would be something that could be pretty difficult. And there aren't a lot of federal officials that it would make sense to give that kind of authority to. So that's a question of enforcement, even if you have the initial power to enact a particular mandate. Another potential federal power to respond to disasters that's vested in Congress by the Constitution is the Spending Clause authority to provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. We've seen already that Congress has allocated money in various different capacities to respond to the pandemic. There are some limitations on this authority, like the spending has to be for the general welfare, which is not much of a limitation, if any, these days. If it's conditional spending, like saying to the state, if you take our money, then you must do this, sort of obligating a state or locality to do a particular thing in return for receiving them money, then that condition has to be sufficiently related to the federal spending purpose. It has to be unambiguously expressed, and it can't be unduly coercive, which is another standard that comes out of the Obamacare case. So But in general, Congress has this power to spend for the public good, and it could probably tie a mask mandate to lots of federal spending that states receive and say, if you want to receive money for this, that, or the other purpose in combating the pandemic, then you have to agree to implement a state or local mask mandate under your state and local authority to do so. And this is actually one of the reasons that you often see congressional power in the disaster context being exercised through the spending clause rather than just through Commerce Clause authority, because it gives them a way to sort of act even when there are some limitations on Commerce Clause authority, like limitations on commandeering officials to enforce a mask mandate. This is a way to incentivize states and localities to do these kind of things. And Congress often uses it in areas where it's sort of primary Commerce Clause authority is unclear, and it's not clear that it would stretch to cover the kinds of things that Congress really wants to do. So pretty common in the disaster context to see exercises of spending clause authority. So there are, of course, other congressional powers that might be relevant, but I want to turn now to thinking about executive authority to respond to disaster. So the executive, the president, has the executive power. He or she is charged with taking care that the laws are faithfully exercised and acting as the commander-in-chief. A lot of the really interesting questions about presidential authority to respond in the case of an emergency or disaster really revolve around the question of how much, if any, inherent authority does the president have to respond in emergency circumstances. And that's something that, of course, is interesting and academically very interesting, and in some contexts practically very interesting. But in the context of the pandemic that we're talking about today, there are a lot of congressional delegations of power to the president. And so most of the discussion really is going to revolve around whether the president has a statutory grant of authority to take specific response action in the context of the pandemic. So I want to talk briefly about a couple of different sources of executive statutory authority to act in the context of the pandemic. The Stafford Act is a big one, the Public Health Service Act, and the Defense Production Act. There's also hundreds of other potentially relevant statutes that grant the president some degree of emergency authority. And we can talk briefly for a second about the National Emergency Act. I wish we were actually having a conversation so I could find out exactly what people are most interested in. And there's also a lot of exceptions to other laws, including FDA regulations and other things like that can potentially be invoked if the president has declared a certain kind of emergency. But let's start with the Stafford Act. So the Stafford Act is the primary statutory framework through which the federal government provides aid to states and localities when natural disasters like hurricanes or tornadoes or floods overwhelm the local capacity to respond. So usually this kind of authority is invoked by first a state declaring their own emergency and then asking for this federal aid. The Stafford Act authorizes two types of declarations that allow the president and FEMA to coordinate relief efforts and to funnel resources to affected areas. The first is major disaster declarations, and the second are emergency declarations. And I apologize for these slides with all these texts. This is the statutory language. So a major disaster means any natural catastrophe, including, and then we have a long list, or regardless of cause, any fire, flood, or explosion in any part of the United States which causes damage of sufficient severity and magnitude to warrant major disaster assistance under the Act in the judgment of the president. So President Trump's use of his Stafford Act authorities has been unprecedented during the COVID-19 pandemic in several respects. It marks the first time that these kind of major disaster declarations have been used for a pandemic, as well as the first time that all 50 states have had these kind of disaster declarations simultaneously. And also we're going to see the first time a president has issued a nationwide emergency declaration without a state request. So As I said, it's the first time that the president has issued a major disaster declaration for a pandemic. The Stafford Act authorizes the president, again, to declare a major disaster under these sets of circumstances upon request by a state governor or tribal leader. And you'll notice that this list has a list of things that include sort of define or give examples of a natural catastrophe, but it doesn't specifically mention pandemics. It mentions landslides and mudslides and tidal waves and all those sorts of things, but not pandemics. So there's long been this debate about whether a pandemic can actually trigger a major disaster declaration. President Trump concluded that pandemics can qualify when he issued a COVID-19 major disaster declaration for New York City, or for New York State rather, on March 20th. By April 11th, every state and territory in the union had a COVID-19 disaster declaration, which marks the first time again for that, but also the first time that all states have had a major disaster declaration at the same time for the same disaster. Usually we have a disaster declaration in parts of California for a wildfire, and maybe also in parts of Washington, and then parts of Iowa might have a disaster declaration for flooding. But this is really the first time every state has had this major disaster declaration for the same disaster. The president has also used his authority to declare Stafford Act emergencies in an unprecedented way. On March 13th, President Trump unilaterally declared a nationwide Stafford Act emergency for COVID-19 without waiting for any requests from individual states. Because the Stafford Act is intended to help when local resources are insufficient, all major disaster declarations and most emergency declarations must be requested by the effective state, tribe, or territory. The president does, however, have power under Section 501B of the Stafford Act to unilaterally declare an emergency without a state request when the president determines that the federal government has primary responsibility for the emergency because the subject area is one for which the federal government exercises exclusive or preeminent responsibility and authority under the Constitution or federal statutes. This power to unilaterally declare a uniquely federal emergency has previously been exercised only when federal property has been attacked or destroyed, as in the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing or the 9/11 attack on the Pentagon. It's never before been used on a national scale or for an incident over which states have so much independent response authority. In declaring the COVID-19 emergency, President Trump asserted that only the federal government can provide the necessary coordination to address a pandemic of this national size and scope, and that it is the preeminent responsibility of the federal government to take action to stem a nationwide pandemic that has its origins abroad. Even after a Stafford Act emergency or disaster is declared, the president has discretion over which, if any, of the Act's powers and resources to deploy. So there's no mandatory exercise of power or mandatory things that have to happen upon this declaration of an emergency or disaster. The powers available to the president include everything from directing any federal agency to use its authorities and resources to support state and local resources by, for example, providing emergency shelters or medical care, to reimbursing states and localities for emergency protective measures such as COVID-19 and distribution of personal protective equipment. It's a little bit hard to get a handle on exactly what the federal government has done with its Stafford Act authority during this pandemic, but some things that we know of include providing reimbursement to states and some nonprofits for personal protective equipment, PPE, using the Army Corps of Engineers to construct alternative care sites when certain areas were really being slammed and having their ICUs overwhelmed, and providing crisis counseling in some states. The act would also give the president authority to do things like distribute food and medicine and other supplies, including, if needed, seizing supplies from private parties, then they have to be compensated, and providing additional aid to individuals and households, including housing assistance, unemployment benefits, and financial assistance with medical expenses. So all of those things are possibilities. That individual and household aid is capped at around $35,000 for any particular disaster. So there's room there certainly for the president to do some of these things if he decided he wanted to. Would the Stafford Act authorize the president to enact a mask mandate? Well, there isn't really any very specific provision on this that seems on point. So what about some of our other statutes that grant emergency power to the president? One of the other big ones is the Public Health Service Act, which gives the Secretary of Health and Human Services, currently Alex Azar, broad authority to respond to public health disasters upon the declaration of a public health emergency. And those powers include authority to deploy federal agencies like the CDC and the NIH to make grants, conduct investigations, and enter into contracts. It also authorizes the establishment of international and interstate quarantine and grants some limited and somewhat disputed power over within state quarantine. The Act also authorizes maintenance of a national strategic stockpile, which can consist either of actual physical supplies or contractual agreements with vendors to deliver needed supplies. Additionally, once a public health emergency is declared under this act, federal law also provides for a waiver of a wide variety of regulatory requirements, including, for example, some FDA rules. So Secretary Azar declared a public health emergency for COVID-19 under this act on January 31st. Does this act give the president power to do something like, if they wanted to have a mask mandate? Well, again, there's not a lot of specific verbiage that seems to cover that. Maybe the closest thing is something like this: under regulations to control communicable diseases, the act provides that the Surgeon General, with the approval of the Secretary of Health and Human Services, is authorized to make and enforce such regulations as in his judgment are necessary to prevent the introduction, transmission, or spread of communicable diseases. So that sounds possible so far, from foreign countries into the states or possessions, or from one state or possession into any other state or possession. So to prevent basically spread between foreign countries in the US or between states in the US. I think you can make a case certainly that mask wearing is a part of preventing spread both intrastate within communities, but then by extension within states. Some people have argued that that reading of the act might be contradicted by some of the later language here that sort of gives some specific things that they do, like providing for inspection and fumigation, disinfection, sanitation, pest extermination, destruction of animals or articles found to be contaminated or affected. So it's, people say, well, this is really focused more on quarantine and on inspection or destruction of animals and articles that are infected. And so those specific examples should inform the reading of this broader language here. So it sort of depends on how broad of a interpretation you want to give to this act. And I suppose if you thought the power of Congress to allow a mask mandate was constitutionally suspect, you might read it more narrowly because of those constitutional questions. I'm not sure those constitutional questions are that hard, but that's also a possibility. Another statute that gives the president considerable authority to react to disasters is the Defense Production Act. The Defense Production Act is one of those emergency statutes that even most disaster law experts didn't know much of anything about before the COVID-19 crisis. Title I of the Act allows the president, as deemed appropriate, to promote national defense by requiring companies to accept and prioritize government contracts for materials and services, including, for example, PPE and ventilators, and to allocate or control the general distribution of materials. Title III of the Defense Production Act is focused on presidential authority to expand production capacity and supply. It allows the president to provide economic incentives to increase domestic supply, including loans, loan guarantees, direct purchases, and purchase commitments. So you can certainly see how some of this language would be and has been relevant to moving ahead on vaccine supplies and other things along those lines, and potentially on ventilators and other things as well. Nothing in this act really seems to allow the president to do something like, say, a mask mandate, a general mask mandate throughout the country. So there are other statutes that are potentially relevant. People often tend to talk about the National Emergencies Act. I'll give you the short version, which is that the National Emergencies Act is not an affirmative grant of power to the president. In fact, it was enacted in order to be a constraint on existing emergency power, and to say it had to be used after a disaster, an emergency declaration. It had to go through certain procedures, and there had to be certain procedures for termination of emergencies. So the National Emergency Act doesn't really give the president any additional authority. It constrains the way that some of the existing authorities are to be used and the kind of explanations that have to be given. There are hundreds of other, 100 plus other statutory emergency powers that could be relevant, some of which have been invoked by the president to move money around to build the wall along our southern border, for instance, but nothing else that is probably worth our focus today. So, what has President Trump and his administration done with these authorities? I want to share some preliminary thoughts on the administration's response. First, on preparation leadership. In judging the adequacy of executive response, we need to consider what came before, because mitigation and preparedness play critical roles in how effective response can be. In disaster law and emergency management more generally, we often talk about cycles of disaster management: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. It's clear that in many respects, we were seriously unprepared for a pandemic of this magnitude. And this isn't really a surprise. We know it's hard to take political credit for death and suffering that's avoided by disaster preparation. And it's hard to muster the political will to deal with issues that aren't salient, that aren't top of mind at the time. And there's plenty of blame for this under preparation to go around. The Strategic National Stockpile, for instance, has been chronically underfunded basically since its inception, especially if what we wanted it to do was function as a resource in a nationwide pandemic rather than just in more regional disasters. But it's also true that the Trump administration halted some of the momentum that the Obama administration built during and after the Ebola crisis. For example, in May 2018, National Security Advisor John Bolton dissolved the National Security Council's Office of Global Health and Security and Biodefense, which was created by President Obama in 2016, cut some staff, and folded the responsibilities for that Global Health Security and Biodefense Directorate into the new NSC Counterproliferation and Biodefense Directorate, which has jurisdiction over arms control and non-proliferation, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, as well as global health and biodefense. And I think this move potentially ignores three important lessons from past disasters like Hurricane Katrina, which was in 2005 and was very much a game changer in the way that we thought about emergency response and what modern kind of emergencies might require of the federal government and states. So here are a couple lessons I think that this ignores. First, one lesson of Katrina is that we really need to have clear, unambiguous lines of authority, and instead, what we have now is sort of overlapping, duplicative authority. Vice President Mike Pence leading White House response, President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, operating a kind of shadow response, Secretary Azar continuing to be in charge of some aspects of the response, et cetera. And this division of authority and responsibility can risk inefficiency and blame shifting and paralysis and delay. Second, history also suggests that when response for so-called natural disasters like pandemics is folded into agencies or directorates that are also tasked with other national defense and terrorism response, this natural disaster response tends to be neglected and overshadowed by these other mandates. This seems to have been a major factor, for example, in the bungled federal response to Katrina, after FEMA was folded into the newly created Department of Homeland Security after 9/11, open, and its responsibilities were sort of divided out into a bunch of different directorates. One of the lessons of this seems to be that we shouldn't put pandemic preparedness in agencies or directorates with a broader focus on national security concerns, because there's a real risk that these natural disaster and public health concerns are going to get subordinated to more salient issues like terrorism. These problems of subordinating disaster response to broader national security concerns are being echoed in recent allegations that the Pentagon has diverted much of the $1 billion fund that Congress gave it in March as part of the CARES Act to increase the country's supply of PPE, like N95 masks, to other military purposes, including buying body armor, dress uniforms, and jet engine parts. The money was supposed to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus, but despite the fact that we are still in the midst of this very, very serious pandemic and that many more lives continue to be at risk, the Pentagon diverted those funds to other military purposes. Another lesson is that Katrina demonstrated the need to have federal officials in charge who have real on-the-ground emergency response experience. Much of the current response is not being run by people who have clear expertise. One of the problems that Congress identified with the response to Katrina was the appointment of FEMA Director Michael Brown as the principal federal officer to coordinate the response, and also for him to have been the director in the first place, because he really didn't have any experience as an emergency manager. And one of the things that the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Act of 2006 did to reform this was to require that the FEMA director have demonstrated ability and knowledge about emergency management and at least 5 years of executive leadership and management experience in relevant sort of public or private sector fields. So this obviously isn't directly on point, doesn't control what's happening with the way that the response is being organized, but I think it suggests that prior disasters tell us we need to really have people in charge who understand what the scope of the disaster is, who understand the science about it, who have the experience and the expertise to respond effectively. And a lot of critique is also focused on the fact that the CDC hasn't been as out front in this pandemic as we might expect. And I think that's related to these issues of expertise. A second critique of the administration's response really focuses on the lack of federal coordination and leadership. One of the chief critiques of the federal response to Hurricane Katrina was the lack of federal coordination, and we see many of those concerns playing out in the context of this pandemic. We knew in early January and February, as we watched the pandemic play out elsewhere, that we probably had insufficient PPE, maybe insufficient ventilators, et cetera, in the country and in our national stockpile. And we also knew that there was a critical need to develop testing and contact tracing capacity. And we could imagine a federal government that took charge of solving these problems by coordinating sourcing of PPE and ventilators. It could also have made much greater use of the DPA, the Defense Production Act, to prioritize contracts or provide loans and purchase guarantees. And instead, the administration largely told states that they were on their own. And the subsequent scrambling of states to purchase limited reserves drove up prices and created bidding wars between states and even between states and the federal government. The president's assertion in declaring the Stafford Act emergency that only the federal government could provide the needed coordination to deal with this pandemic contrasts sharply with this later insistence that states have primary responsibility for a pandemic response, including securing testing supplies and personal protective equipment, even when the absence of federal coordination results in these kind of bidding wars between states. How much harm has this failure of federal coordination done? It seems like it's potentially substantial, but that assessment also turns in part on how well and how competently the administration would have done at sourcing and distributing equipment like PPE. And we know that federal coordination and centralization can be problematic. So if you think about the insistence early on that all private labs use only the flawed CDC test for COVID-19 testing, I'm not really convinced that federal coordination would have been better, in part because of the president's own suggestion that the distribution of supplies like ventilators and PPE wouldn't be based on clear need or other reasonable criteria, but on which states' governors express sufficient support for administration policies. And this leads to my final critique, which is about lack of transparency. Well, actually not my final critique, there's gonna be a few more. This leads to another of my critiques, which is about disinformation and the lack of transparency. We have observed a serious lack of transparency in the way that the Trump administration is conducting the response. Transparency is, of course, no panacea for all disaster problems, but it's particularly critical in disaster for a number of reasons, including the fact that once a disaster emergency is declared, there is lots of government discretion over response. Many of the normal rules that guide and limit, for example, government contracting, go out the window, and that means that the only real check on these processes is often political accountability. Additionally, public trust is critical to public willingness to comply with government recommendations during a disaster. In a paper I co-authored in 2013, we listed a wide array of potential government motivations for government withholding or distorting of information during disasters. So I want you to think about the things that we've seen so far in the pandemic response, both at the Trump administration level, but also from some states and localities. We noted that on the one end of the spectrum are particularly malicious motivations for information withholding that are driven by political self-interest rather than any notion of the public good. Such motivations might include face-saving attempts, including attempts to cover up or minimize the extent of disaster, blame deflection impulses, power grabs, perhaps justified by exaggerating a disaster scope, attempts to minimize liability risk to the government or private tortfeasors, other political aims, and general public relations or image enhancement goals. So that's on the more nefarious end. On the other end of the spectrum are more benevolent motivations for information failures, motivations rooted in an impulse, however misguided, to serve the public good and ensure greater public safety. Such motivations might include fear that providing information prematurely to the public will cause confusion or chaos, fear that full information about the risks at hand might cause people to panic, and, for example, engage in irrational or unsafe flight or unnecessary and risky counter-health measures, or fear of warning fatigue caused by public perceptions that officials have repeatedly cried wolf when warning about impending disasters. And then in the middle of these two extremes are some arguably neutral government motivations, neither malicious nor benevolent, but nonetheless produce failed information flow. Most of these involve governments that neither selfishly serve their own political or public relations purposes, nor acted out of particular concern for the public, but instead simply lacked the communicative competencies to offer a useful and accurate flow of disaster information. Among these explanations are disorganization, lack of planning and preparedness, and the communication of less than useful information, often because the format is in one that's difficult for ordinary citizens to decipher. So our point is that government, both at its best and its worst, finds itself with temptation to restrict information flow during disasters. And we find that all of these impulses really end up being problematic because of these reasons that transparency in disaster is so important, including to public trust. So let's evaluate a little bit how the Trump administration has done on this front. We could do the same thing about some states. The president has consistently engaged, not exactly consistently, but at least over time in different contexts and mostly consistency, engaged in the downplaying of risk and denying the seriousness of the pandemic. And that meant during the early months, while he was publicly denying the serious, he was squandering valuable time in which we could have been sourcing PPE and developing testing and tracking capacity that would have helped limit deaths and also might have lessened the need for stay-at-home orders and lockdowns. It also has led to serious ongoing debate about some things that should be a matter of just scientific fact about how the virus is spread, about how serious it is, whether it's the same as the flu or not. What about the president's reasoning that he was trying to avoid public panic? Even well-meaning government attempts, if we assume that's what it was, to withhold information or mislead the public, to placate or to avoid public panic, undermine crucial relationships of trust. Government downplaying of risk during the 1918 flu epidemic increased disease transmission and produced citizens more inclined to believe rumors, and we might add conspiracy theories, than official information. More recently, the government in Japan's withholding of information about radiation of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant meltdown triggered by the 2011 earthquake and tsunami there led people to evacuate into the predicted but undisclosed path of the radiation plume, exacerbating residents' exposures and generating so much anger and distress that a local official accused the Japanese government of murder. So it's really a serious thing to downplay, to withhold information. We also have had a lack of transparency about the distribution of resources. As I noted earlier, Trump's own words give us reason to doubt that medical equipment is being distributed according to reasonable criteria like need, but it's been really difficult to get good information about where supplies are going and why. Operation Airbridge, in which the federal government chartered planes to bring medical supplies to the US, and then some of the transported supplies were supposed to go in the national stockpile and others could be sold by participating companies, has operated without much transparency. Likewise, we have a real need to have increased transparency around programs like Operation Warp Speed, designed to speed development of vaccines. And ultimately, we will need clear, established, transparent criteria about how the vaccine is approved and how vaccine doses will be distributed. Some of the companies who are involved in this effort are trying to release their own data and trying to be transparent about this, in part to counteract the lack of transparency that is happening to some degree at the administration level. Related to this is a problem about the role of science and scientific advisors, concerns that political pressure is overriding the FDA's scientific judgment or the CDC's scientific judgment can make people deeply skeptical about the measures that are being recommended. And that seems to be happening already in the context of the vaccine. A survey conducted by the Pew Research Center earlier this month found that 51% of Americans would either probably or definitely take a vaccine. So only about half, a significant drop from 72% in May. So the number of people who are trusting in this vaccine and who are willing to get it is dropping fairly precipitously below the levels that can get us herd immunity. And the chief concern among those surveyed was that the vaccine approval process would move too quickly without taking time to properly establish safety and effectiveness. And really one of the few cures for this, if there is one at this point, is really to have transparency. And if the government, in the sense of political leaders, are going to override scientific determinations by career scientists, they need to tell us when they're doing that and why they're doing it so we can make a reasonable evaluation of what's happening. You can also think about the messaging around masks. There might have been some confusion about the science early on and what it showed. I think that's fair. But the confused messaging about masks also seemed to be based in part on this idea that we needed to preserve the masks for first responders and for people working in hospitals, which was definitely true. But the way to do that is not to mislead people about the effectiveness of masks, because it creates further problems down the line. Requisition them, prohibit the sale of them to private individuals. Don't sort of dissemble about their effectiveness once their effectiveness became clear. And I think President Trump's sort of inconsistent messaging, shall we say, but mostly consistent on the masks don't work side, has been part and parcel of his larger downplaying of the risk. And that leads me to another critique about narratives and how leadership matters. In a disaster, there are lots of different narratives and stories that could emerge. You could imagine that the story that we had about this disaster was one of shared sacrifice, about innovation and calling on all segments of our society to come together to meet this challenge together, to band together to protect the most vulnerable elements among us. Instead, in part, in not small part, and maybe in large part, because of the messaging coming from the top, what we have is confusion, division, partisanship. We have turned mask wearing into a partisan issue. I worry that we are going to turn the vaccine issue into a partisan issue. And we really need to have leaders who rise above this partisanship, who say it's not a partisan issue whether we engage in public health measures. It's just a matter of public health. And if we can't have better messaging about this, if we can't have a better narrative that what we're doing is coming together based on good scientific evidence to do things that protect the most vulnerable among us, like by wearing masks so we prevent general spread and community spread, we're really not going to be in a good position to save the lives that we could save. So related to this is the idea that social vulnerability matters. While the old adage suggests that rain falls on the rich and poor alike, the history of disasters makes clear that the consequences of disaster almost always fall most heavily on already vulnerable populations. It may rain on all of us, but some people are significantly more likely to be cold and wet already, to be susceptible to getting sick if they get rained on, or to have a leaky roof or no roof at all. One renowned disaster sociologist often said, disasters make us more of who we already are. I think this assessment of disasters' impact means a lot of different things. We don't become totally different people in disasters. We generally behave mostly as we usually do, adhering to most of the same norms that we do in everyday life. And this is generally a positive thing. We don't usually devolve into our worst selves. But another thing this means is that disasters tend to highlight existing fault lines in society, and not just to shine a light on these fault lines, but to deepen and to exacerbate them. And chief among these is inequality, whether we're talking about wealth inequality or racial inequality or anything else. Recent investigations by NPR found that after disasters, rich people tend to get richer and poor people get poorer. And not only that, but federal disaster spending appears to exacerbate that wealth inequality. And it certainly seems to be true so far in this pandemic. A lot of billionaires are making out awfully well, and those who are already at the margins tend to be suffering the most. The number of children who've died of COVID-19 is thankfully small, but a recent CDC report found that of 121 children who had died, 78% were Hispanic, Black, or Indigenous. More generally, Indigenous people have contracted COVID-19 at a rate close to 3 times higher than white people, and have been hospitalized at a rate 5.3 times higher than white people, and died at a rate 1.4 times higher. We see similar statistics for Black Americans and for Hispanics. And so there's this real impact of this disaster on the already vulnerable that we really need to be attentive to, that we need to pay better attention to, that we need to direct resources to, that we need to think about when we're thinking about the long-term impacts of the educational gaps that the pandemic is unfortunately creating, and that we also need to be attentive to as we think about democracy and voting. So my last point is that democracy and voting matters, and we should be taking every measure that we can to help people to safely vote. If I had a lot of time, I would have a lot more to say about this, but I think it is one of the jobs of lawyers to make sure that voting is sacrosanct, that we protect it in this context, and that we really make sure that even the most vulnerable among us have the chance to vote. And Utah has done a great job of this with things we already had in place with universal mail-in voting, but we need to continue to take steps and encourage other jurisdictions to take steps to make sure that happens. Wish I had more time to discuss that, but we're getting short. So I just want to say a few things that I think lawyers can do. And one is this role in protecting voting. Another is in demanding accountability and transparency. And I think lastly, one of the things that lawyers are supposed to be good at doing is communicating and in translating complex legal rules to the general public. And I think we can also be translators of science and policy. We can sort of be intermediaries. That means that we have, I think, particular responsibilities to check our facts, to resist conspiracy theories, to resist easy but incorrect answers, to embrace the complexity that is here, but also to communicate about things in ways that can bring people together, that can sort of emphasize what's most important as we move through this pandemic over the next several months. So thank you for your attention and for the opportunity to speak to you today. And I look forward to seeing what all of you do on these many efforts to help us to weather this disaster as well as future disasters as best we can. Thanks.